The economic landscape of Europe is shifting dramatically. Once seen as the bastion of wealth and stability, Germany, Italy, and France now face unprecedented challenges that threaten their foundational roles in the global economy. Tune in as we unpack these complexities and what they mean for the future of Europe. For many centuries, the European continent stood as a bedrock of financial consistency within the world's economic landscape, home to some of its wealthiest and most developed states. Germany's formidable manufacturing capabilities, France's distinctive societal framework, and Italy's enduring cultural and fiscal heritage have profoundly influenced not merely the continent, but also international economic doctrines, yet that steadfastness and the accompanying affluence are now unmistakably showing signs of strain. Expansion has faltered, populations are aging, efficiency lags, and capital inflow is diminishing. Once considered exemplary, these faltering powers are now serving as cautionary narratives. Germany is reevaluating its manufacturing approach. Italy contends with protracted structural economic inertness, and France strives to reconcile social welfare with fiscal competitiveness. While we have individually examined these situations previously, their collective presentation reveals a more profound narrative. A continent grappling with challenges that have accumulated over decades, and three significant economies attempting often, without success, to redefine themselves. This epitomizes Europe's current economic state. Stagnation, vulnerability, and a gradual erosion of the influence it once considered inherent. Germany is currently renowned as much for its exceptional engineering prowess as for its substantial beer, Stein's sausages, and complex past. Recently, Germany ascended to become the world's third-largest economy, trailing only China, and the USA having surpassed a stagnant Japan. It unequivocally stands as the most potent and influential economy within the European Union, with a substantial portion of its economic success stemming from its capacity to produce extremely high-grade manufactured goods. Of course, the nation's automobiles come to mind, but these constitute a surprisingly modest fraction of the country's total manufacturing output, and an even smaller proportion of its exports. Germany truly lives up to its standing by being a global leader in a vast array of engineered products, from aerospace components and medical devices to centrifuges utilized in nuclear energy. Essentially, if something demands precision manufacturing, it's highly probable that a German factory is or was making it. A confluence of internal and external pressures has severely impacted German industry, leading many economists and commentators to forecast the potential complete loss of its industrial supremacy. This is a substantial assertion, one that would signify a major shift in national, regional, and indeed global trade. However, even if this prediction materializes, it might not be as detrimental as it sounds for the world's third-largest economy. To understand why, we must as always address a few crucial questions. So, what underpins economists' predictions of the end of Germany's industrial dominance? Why is this occurring now? And finally, why might this actually prove beneficial for Germany, as the world has embraced greater international cooperation, facilitating freer trade of goods and services between nations globally? There has been a general tendency for countries to specialize in their strongest areas. A nation like China possesses an immense and relatively industrially adept populace, a favorable global position for commerce, and a political framework highly conducive to rapid expansion, thereby establishing itself as a global hub for low-cost production. Singapore, with its diminutive landmass and comparatively small populace, has cultivated a highly stable political system and is situated at the nexus of the world's busiest trade routes, making it an intensely competitive commercial and refueling center. These economic characteristics give rise to what is termed comparative advantage. Regardless of Singapore's efforts, it simply lacks the land area or human resources to rival China's industrial might. Similarly, without drastic changes to its operational paradigm, no international business would relocate its activities to China due to the significant political risks involved. Thus, China holds a comparative advantage in manufacturing basic goods, while Singapore excels in providing financial services and serving as an international service station, glorified in its function. As long as these countries largely maintain cooperative relations, these strengths and weaknesses are mutually beneficial, enabling Singapore to acquire affordable consumer products from China and Chinese shipping enterprises to use Singapore for fuel, or to manage international finances on an individual level within our own economies, we have become more prosperous by specializing in tasks we perform exceptionally well, allowing others to do the same, and then engaging in trade. Most individuals lack the expertise to perform surgery on themselves, but this is acceptable because they can compensate doctors for such services using earnings from their own specialized professions. Free trade and leveraging comparative advantage allow entire national economies to effectively pursue the same strategy, which in theory should be highly beneficial. Highly specialized roles in modern economies are a primary reason for the world's current affluence, but challenges can emerge at a national scale, at a personal level, particularly within advanced and politically stable economies. There are established authorities and institutions to mediate disputes. Globally, such mechanisms are largely absent, while organizations like the World Trade Organization and the UN serve as mediators. If one country opts to cease trade with another, there is little recourse short of declaring war. This intricate balance of holding a valuable position in global trade without becoming excessively reliant on it is particularly crucial for Germany due to its distinct advantages. Germany possesses a highly skilled workforce, especially in engineering and manufacturing fields, a favorable geographical location within Europe, and for several decades enjoyed access to exceptionally inexpensive energy. These factors collectively granted it a strong comparative advantage in the production of high-end industrial goods. Typically, when considering how to achieve an economic edge in manufacturing, the initial thought turns to lowering labor costs, so factories can pay their workers less, thereby reducing overall production expenses. This explains why regions like China produce so much of the world's goods. However, as wages in China have risen, global manufacturers are exploring more affordable alternatives in countries such as India. Now Germany is home to some of the highest paid workers globally, so superficially, its continued competitiveness against cheaper global hubs seems counterintuitive, yet depending on the type of manufacturing, labor expenses are not as critical as one might presume. Most German industry heavily relies on either highly advanced machinery and tools for production, or they creating something so valuable that the wage difference between paying someone $2 an hour versus $50 an hour makes virtually no impact on the final price. German automotive factories utilize extensive automated machinery, with only a few highly skilled workers operating these machines, to produce 100 times more cars per worker than they could with basic hand tools. At that scale, paying highly skilled German workers more has remained competitive because the advantage derived from possessing the machines and the expertise to utilize them, rather than from having workers willing to accept the lowest possible wage. In contrast, products, typically manufactured by countries like China, often involve more fundamental tools and extensive manual assembly. Of course, some German cars are also handcrafted, but these tend to be extremely high-value items, for which the end consumer is willing to pay a premium. For a vehicle handbuilt in Germany, this reputation has actually been one of the most significant contributors to Germany's comparative advantage in manufacturing. Its global renown. A clearer illustration of this point would be products from a company like Siemens. While an unfortunate name for a YouTube video, it remains one of the country's largest manufacturers. They produce items such as nuclear centrifuges and all related components. These machines cost hundreds of millions of dollars to manufacture and install, and in such cases, not only does the reputation of German engineering carry immense weight, but it also represents the kind of product that only Germany and a select few other nations worldwide would be permitted to produce, without inciting geopolitical tensions. Labor costs for such machinery are practically negligible, so the high wages of German workers pose no real issue. Other input costs, particularly energy, are more critical for the highly mechanized industries operating in Germany. In the past, this was actually one of the country's greatest strengths. Since the mid-1990s, it has been able to import very affordable natural gas directly from Russia and Norway, which possess some of the world's largest reserves of this energy source. Clearly, there have been complications with this over the last 2 years, and elevated energy costs are impacting German manufacturing more profoundly than increased wages. Ever could. This is just the initial factor driving a shift away from Germany. The energy crisis particularly severely affected many German businesses, because the country remains heavily reliant on inexpensive fossil fuels to power its incredibly energy-intensive factories. However, German manufacturing was already in decline well before that. And this trend, too, can be elucidated by meticulously examining the original contributors to the country's comparative advantage. Its exceptionally talented and highly skilled workforce is growing older, and thanks to generous retirement benefits a central feature of the country's economic system, people are exiting the labor force earlier than they might otherwise need to, of course, at an individual level. This is excellent. People should not have to compromise their quality of life for the sake of economic metrics. However, businesses within Germany are grappling with this issue. Typically, advanced economies can offset this by attracting skilled migrants from nations with lower living standards. But Germany has also struggled in this regard. Skilled workers are simply not as drawn to Germany as they are to places like Australia, Canada, the UK. And particularly, the USA. Part of this is simply the language. English is far more widely spoken as both a first and second language than German, but other factors also contribute. The stringent training standards that have bolstered Germany's strong manufacturing reputation mean that even workers seeking low-skilled roles often must navigate bureaucratic training certifications that can take years before they can begin employment. Whatever the underlying cause, the outcomes are consistent. Germany faces a severe labor shortage with over 750,000 job openings in some of its core industries, remaining unfilled. Gaining a comparative advantage based on the quality of its manufacturing also meant that it was only a matter of time before other nations caught up. Today, Chinese manufacturing is no longer as far behind German manufacturing as it once was. China is producing automobiles, batteries, aircraft, and advanced machinery that genuinely rivals German products. Of course, China still manufactures many low-quality goods, which is why it retains a poor reputation for subpar products. But it has demonstrated its genuine ability to compete in the advanced manufacturing sector as well. Today, more BMWs are produced in China than in Germany, and despite this metric perhaps being a source of national embarrassment, it ironically highlights how one of Germany's greatest opportunities is concealed behind this seemingly negative news. German companies can command a premium over companies from other countries for their manufactured goods because consumers perceive German-made products as a high-quality alternative. Whether that perception is accurate, well, just ask anyone who has tried to maintain a Volkswagen. Reality doesn't always matter. What also often doesn't matter is the actual place of manufacture. People simply see a German company and assume the goods were produced in Germany. If predictions of German industrial decline prove accurate, then the country could leverage its advantage of possessing a stellar reputation for producing premium-worthy goods without incurring any of the disadvantages of actually having to produce them within Germany. Germany's scaling back of its manufacturing is in many respects somewhat overdue compared to other advanced economies, even those with their own large domestic automakers and high-end manufacturers. Germany has approximately 50% more of its population employed in industrial roles. These positions can be made more productive by equipping workers with more advanced tools and technology to enhance their output. But there is an eventual limit. A worker manually assembling a car might take a month to complete one unit, whereas a small team overseeing large industrial presses and robotic assembly arms could produce 1,000 a day. Since they produce more, there is greater scope to pay them more, which explains why salaries in advanced economies are higher. However, eventually, it becomes more beneficial for these workers to transition into service roles, where instead of directly supervising manufacturing, they spend their time establishing infrastructure and training teams in other countries to perform the work for them. The USA stands as the world's largest economy today, largely because it is home to companies that conduct most of their operations overseas but still repatriate the wealth generated from these activities. For the past 3 decades, Germany has opted to keep more operations in-house, but the shift away from domestic manufacturing is less a failure of its industries and more a logical next step for its advanced economy. Nonetheless, this does not imply an absence of significant challenges. If this transition away from local manufacturing persists, it would signify a monumental shift in a major economy, and any change of Such magnitude invariably entails repercussions. Workers across Germany are already protesting government alterations to energy subsidies and tax regulations. And while these protests are primarily concentrated in agriculture and transport for now, they are symptomatic of a broader shift in how business has traditionally been conducted in the country. Historically, Germany has maintained very harmonious relations between labor and corporations, largely because German workers are robustly represented by powerful unions, and the economy itself is managed in a way that safeguards workers' rights. This model functions effectively when German companies require German workers. However, if they can offshore a substantial portion of their operations, it could undermine the highly egalitarian economic system upon which modern Germany has been built. Even from the perspective of a purely dispassionate macroeconomist, solely concerned with headline economic figures, the move away from domestic industry could still present risks. The workforce might transition into more productive and valuing service roles, potentially making the country even wealthier. But the shift from a role like directly installing engines into a car to training a foreign team to install an engine demands a different set of skills. Furthermore, there's no guarantee that this shift would directly lead to better jobs for Germans, rather than simply fewer jobs for Germans. Installing engines might not be as valuable as training a new team to install engines, but it does provide employment as long as cars need to be made. Once a foreign team has been trained to perform a task previously done by a German worker, the German worker may no longer be needed. Beyond that, a country's reputation is much like that of a company, an individual, or anything else really. If German companies fail to maintain their standards while establishing international operations, they will very quickly lose the significant segment of consumers willing to pay a premium for a product that is at least theoretically German. Germany's slowdown has surprised many, because for decades, it was the economic anchor of the EU. But while Germany's issues are relatively recent, Italy has contended with stagnation for a far longer period, from sluggish growth to persistent inequality and a diminishing workforce. Italy's economy reflects deeper challenges confronting parts of Europe that never fully recuperated from past crises. Italy's economy is one of the most intriguing worldwide because it confronts most, if not all, of the significant economic challenges that other nations globally are experiencing, yet it somehow manages to contend with them all simultaneously. Italy carries some of the highest levels of national debt, globally possesses an aging population, experiences an exodus of its limited number of young skilled workers, and grapples with regional disparities, sluggish expansion, inconsistent tax revenues, and its once world-leading industries have been outcompeted on a global scale. Italy also serves as a remarkable case study of a country that has navigated issues like globalization, nearshoring, and restricted trade problems that are currently causing considerable concern among countries such as the USA, Russia, China, the Gulf states, and of course Europe itself. Many of these uncertainties are issues Italy has been dealing with for at least the past 2 decades, which partly explains why the country's economy has been in decline 15 years now. While this sounds problematic, it is strangely something that on one hand, the economy is weathering with resilience, and on the other has resulted in some of the highest poverty rates within the European Union, a collection of nations, typically associated with relative prosperity, at least compared to most of the world. Even if the parallels aren't perfect, economists can still glean substantial insights from these challenges, beyond merely offering a profound glimpse into what the future our own economies might resemble. Italy possesses some truly captivating economic features, worth exploring individually, if for no other reason than their sheer intrigue. Italy, alongside Germany and France, contributes over half of the total economic output of the European Union, a bloc that collectively constitutes the world's second-largest operating economy. Despite this already impressive scale, Italy's economy might genuinely be considerably larger than its government is willing to acknowledge. In recent years, the informal economy has accounted for as much as a quarter of Italy's total economic output. And while the logical assumption here might be to think of organized crime, the reality is even more peculiar and compelling. So, to fully grasp all that Italy's economy can impart, we must as always address a few straightforward questions. How did one of the fastest-growing advanced economies in the world abruptly cease growth? Not once, not twice, but 3 times. What has the country done correctly and incorrectly in tackling its extensive list of challenges. Who or what was truly responsible for the nation's economic stagnation? How has Italy been affected by a distinctive form of destructive inequality? And finally, is the country's economic model simply incompatible with the new global environment in which it finds itself? Italy's economy reached its zenith in 2008. Since then, it has largely stagnated, experiencing an overall gradual decline, shedding approximately 20% of its nominal economic output over the past decade. A broader historical examination, however, reveals that this is not entirely new for Italy. Its current economic situation is a continuation of a pattern that has recurred in the country since the end of the Second World War. The nation has experienced decades of rapid expansion, interspersed with periods of almost complete stagnation, and in many instances negative growth, before resuming its upward trajectory. Economic output is merely one indicator of an economy's health, but even such a basic chart vividly illustrates Italy's path to its current predicament. Italy was historically the most powerful industrial economy in Europe, before being overtaken by the Netherlands and England, as they emerged as global colonial powers. Even after this, and despite industrializing more slowly than other major European powers like France and Germany, Italy, in its various incarnations, has remained among the top 5 European economies for effectively thousands of years. Its advantageous geography, protected by mountains to the north, but with easy access to the Mediterranean for fishing and trade in all other directions, naturally made it an ideal location for civilizations to thrive, a truth that holds for its economy today as it did in 500 BC. The contemporary Italian economy essentially began in the aftermath of the Second World War. The nation was reconstructed in many cases from actual ruins, as wartime industries were repurposed into domestic ones, with aid from and under the careful supervision of the USA through the Marshall Plan. The USA invested billions of dollars into the reconstruction of Western Europe. This was in the 1950s, a time when billions of dollars held significant weight in government budgets. The motivation for this expenditure was partly to cultivate a new customer base, capable of purchasing the goods produced by the U.S. industrial sector. But primarily, it aimed to redevelop strong dependent allies to contain the spread of communism from the Soviet Union. The USA undertook similar rebuilding efforts in Korea, and Japan to curb the expansion of communist influence. Emanating from the People's Republic of China, while not starting from an ideal position, these reconstruction endeavors did lead to a prolonged period of sustained growth. However, underlying political tensions persisted, causing a range of very serious domestic issues, such as the 1980 bombing of the Bologna railway station, which remains one of the deadliest attacks ever carried out in Europe. These political tensions were in many ways both a cause and an accelerator of other economic problems. The country based solely on economic output figures, Italy appeared to be performing very well. However, it is relatively easy to expand an economy by simply accumulating substantial debt to finance major development projects, especially when the world's dominant power was more than willing to lend money to stem the spread of communism. The challenge lies in leveraging that development to sustainably generate value for the domestic economy and export markets, something Italy struggled achieve once construction and rebuilding efforts slowed down or could no longer secure further funding. Italy's economy entered its first modern decade of stagnation. Although this initial period lasted only about 6 years. During this time, the Italian government simultaneously contended with widespread unemployment, a considerable debt burden, high inflation, and external challenges, like rising energy costs for the fossil fuels, on which its nascent industries had become heavily reliant. Now, despite being difficult to endure, economic slowdowns do provide a valuable opportunity for a country to revise policies and curtail industries that contributed to the initial problems during this first period of stagnation. Precisely, that occurred, the nation restructured its focus away from merely building infrastructure and directed its attention towards utilizing that infrastructure to create goods it could sell worldwide. It also enacted reforms, such as granting independence to its central bank, which was then empowered to raise interest rates to combat inflation. Simultaneously, regulations concerning indexed wages were relaxed. Wage indexation is uncommon today primarily due to the market distortions it causes. but it is a rule mandating that wages keep pace with inflation, regardless of what was initially agreed upon in an employment contract. Superficially, this sounds equitable. If inflation is high, it may seem unfair for workers to effectively earn less because they accepted a salary, when that same amount of money could purchase considerably more. The problem, however, is that automatic wage indexation accelerates one of the most perilous processes in economics. A wage price spiral. If inflation is high, workers will demand increased wages to keep pace with the rising cost of essential goods and services. If businesses concede to these higher wages, they will be compelled to increase their prices to maintain profitability, and higher prices in turn generate more inflation, perpetuating the cycle. A factor that often protects many economies from this is the time lag between inflation occurring and people demanding higher wages. If inflation is low, many individuals may not even realize that their wages are not keeping up, which is detrimental for them, but acts as a moderating force in the economy. If wages are automatically adjusted for inflation, as they were in Italy during this period, it simply makes this process, known as the wage price spiral, much faster and considerably more difficult to correct. The stagnation was undeniably painful for Italy, but by compelling some necessary changes, it rebounded as one of the fastest growing economies, not only globally, but historically. In just 7 years, between 1985 and 1992, Italy tripled its economic output in an export-driven industrial boom. The country possesses a significant advantage in this regard that is difficult to discern solely from economic figures. International customers pay a premium for Italian-made goods because the country had and still has a strong reputation for high-quality craftsmanship and expertise in producing everything from high-performance cars to luxury handbags, and even items like olive oil. If an exported product bears a Made in Italy label, its price can be higher than that of a competitor's product from most other countries worldwide, and many consumers would still be willing to pay a premium for it. Some nations must resort to extreme measures to undercut a long list of international rivals at every possible opportunity to supply the cheapest and therefore most competitive goods to the global market. The fact that Italy can add as much, if not more, value simply by producing items within its borders is a huge advantage truly enjoyed by only a handful of other countries globally. These prosperous times, regrettably, did not endure indefinitely, as the rapid period of growth once again gave rise to underlying issues within the Italian economy. Debt began to mount again, as both the government and its populace started borrowing irresponsibly, speculating on even greater future growth. The country also grappled with widespread tax evasion. The small industries, forming the backbone of the Italian export miracle, were notoriously difficult to tax, and exploiting weak government oversight and poorly conceived loopholes to pay little to no tax almost became a national pastime. Now, overall, whether intentionally or not, reducing taxation and government restrictions, while simultaneously increasing spending through debt, represents a classic expansionary economic policy, even if the government didn't necessarily intend it. This was likely what the country needed to escape the predicament it found itself in during the 1980s. However, to gain entry into the Eurozone and be permitted to use the European Union's new currency, Italy was compelled to reform its practices. It had to reduce its debt burden and improve its efforts to ensure its citizens paid their taxes. Increasing regulation, reducing debt, and raising taxes all worked to withdraw money from the economy, which, even if it was the correct course of action, still applied the brakes to economic growth. For the remainder of the 1990s, Italy's economy, once again, entered an almost decade-long period of stagnation. Fortunately, for the country, the adoption of the euro in 1999 presented a golden opportunity for Italy to resume growth. After a brief lull, the nation, in what was becoming a recurring pattern, more than doubled its economic output in less than a decade, once again becoming one of the fastest-growing advanced economies worldwide. Entering the Eurozone facilitated attracting foreign investment, foreign workers, and foreign buyers for its goods. Its trading partners also no longer had to concern themselves with the foreign exchange risk associated with the notoriously unstable lira. The benefits of the Eurozone also coincided with the further general development of Italian manufacturing and the rise of industries like tourism. Then, of course, the country was struck by the global financial crisis, and the Eurozone crisis. And ever since it has fallen into yet another period of stagnation, only this time, instead of lasting less than a decade, it has continued for almost 15 years. The reason we have spent such a significant amount of time delving into the specifics of Italy's distinctive economic history of booms and plateaus is because it poses an obvious question for the nation. Can it repeat this pattern? Naturally, no one can foretell the future, least of all economists. But if history is any guide, it appears Italy is overdue for another ascent in its peculiar staircase of economic output. Unfortunately, it's not that simple, and a range of new challenges are now converging with some of the long-standing historical issues, making a characteristic Italian turnaround improbable. The first is simply an aging population. Italy possesses one of the world's oldest populations, and a significant portion of its workforce is nearing retirement. This alone would not be a problem, except for the fact that it has a low birth rate, meaning young people are not entering the workforce in sufficient numbers to replace those exiting, who will ultimately and regrettably, there's no gentler way to phrase this, become a drain on resources. This problem has also been exacerbated by Italy's exceptionally high rate of young graduates relocating to other countries where they can command higher earnings for their skills. Earlier this year, we had the privilege of speaking with Professor Billari from the University of Bocconi in Italy. As both a highly respected economist and someone with first-hand experience training some of Italy's most brilliant students, he offered invaluable insight into this predicament. Actually, Italy is a net sender of graduates rather than a net receiver, and that's one of the parts that the country is complaining about. So we'd love to attract more people with a degree rather than let them leave to other countries. So I think from the country's perspective it is a problem, especially if you are one of the sending countries. However, let me say two things on this one. Is that from the individual level perspective, having more freedom of movement is certainly giving the right incentive to individuals. You want to build a good life, you have good ideas, it's fantastic for the world to let these people move. The second point of view is that we have to understand from the competition for talent perspective that countries that are losing these individuals may be because they tend to be overeducated for the level of the economy in that country. Should think seriously about the opportunities that in a specific country or region are given to these individuals. Membership in the EU has only intensified this problem because Italian students wishing to work in places like Germany, France, the Netherlands, or even Luxembourg do not even require a visa, thanks to the EU's policy allowing workers to move freely within member states. Increasing wages could help stem this exodus of skilled young Italians, but the country's industries can no longer afford to compete with their largest European rivals because they are simply less productive. The average size of an Italian business is considerably smaller than the average size of a business in other advanced European economies. Italy, on average, has 36 workers per company, whereas the average for Western Europe is 15, effectively 4 times as many workers per organization. In industrialized economies, size does matter, and larger companies are capable of producing more specialized and higher value items. In most highly advanced industries, the marginal benefit of adding an additional worker is positive because it allows employees within the business to focus on one aspect of production and execute it exceptionally well. Given that automobiles are one of Italy's largest industries and likely the first thing people associate with Italian manufacturing, it serves as an excellent example. 10 companies, each with one employee who builds cars from scratch, will produce fewer cars in a year than one company with 10 employees, each specializing in a single component of car assembly. If one employee solely builds engines, they can become incredibly proficient at that specific task. The company with 10 employees can also spend 10 times as much on tools for those workers, which, even though it still amounts to the exact same cost per individual employee, means the tools can be more specialized. The worker who exclusively builds engines can be given tools specifically designed for engine work, whereas a worker who must assemble the entire car will need to allocate their tool budget across everything required to construct the vehicle, making their tools less specialized and ultimately less efficient. Now, tools for building cars are one thing, but something Italian firms have significantly failed to invest in is technology. Computers and related technologies have vastly amplified the economic value a single worker can generate in a given day. The classic example is that one accountant with a basic tool like Excel can produce the same volume of financial reports as 10 accountants using an abacus. Italy's small firms have fallen behind the rest of Europe in adopting technology, and Western Europe itself has lagged behind the USA and many Asian economies, besides making investments into industries more efficient. Technology has become a colossal industry in its own right, with the majority of the world's largest companies being tech firms. Italy, of course, in some ways benefits from these cottage industries because it helps them maintain their reputation as a place where businesses prioritize quality over quantity when producing luxurious goods. However, countries like the UK, France, and Germany achieve the same without actually sacrificing size. Mercedes from Germany employs a similar number of workers as Fiat in Italy. Mercedes is far more premium and generates significantly higher export markups than economy cars. A large number of small companies is also more challenging to tax than a small number of large companies, which also underscores another problem within the Italian economy. The black market in Italy is exceptionally large for an advanced economy, and despite its reputation, most of it is not attributable to organized crime. It's simply unofficial businesses operating in gray markets to circumvent regulations and avoid taxation. In the past, as much as 25% of the nation's economy was composed of black market industries. That figure is closer to 12% today, which is an improvement, but it remains quite poor and is not only costing the nation potential tax revenues, but also contributing to social problems. Part of the reason the informal economy remains so substantial is that people have few other options. Italy is an advanced economy, but it has some of the highest poverty rates in all of Europe, and this is particularly severe in the south of the country, which is significantly poorer than the north, and which, as we've already explored, is still struggling itself. Unfortunately, Italy today finds itself in a precarious position, with high unemployment, stagnant economic output, an aging population, uncompetitive industries, low tax revenues, high debt, and increasing interest payments on that debt, all while possessing less control over its own currency than in the past. If it raises taxes and reduces spending to try and diminish its debt burden, it will cripple its already struggling local industries. If it borrows more, it risks self-bankruptcy, and if it does nothing, the situation is likely only to worsen. There is an assumption in economics, and in most sciences for that matter, that we are progressing towards an idealized future, because for the last 2 centuries that is precisely what has been happening. The world today is thousands of times wealthier than it was at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, but that has been the exception rather than the norm. Italy is just another in a long line of advanced economies finding it increasingly difficult to compete in an increasingly competitive global economy, and just because we have experienced growth for all of living memory does not guarantee it will continue into the future. While Italy's challenges are deeply linked to political instability and industrial decline, France presents a fundamentally different case. France's predicament is more philosophical. It concerns how a nation balances economic output with quality of life. The French model, founded on robust worker protections and public services, is beginning to fray under global economic pressures, yet its citizens are not yielding without a struggle. Here is why France's economic model is approaching a critical juncture. France has historically been one of the most successful economies, but in the last decade alone, it has in many respects lost what made it distinctive for a number of unfortunate, albeit necessary, reasons. France was one of the first countries globally to initiate the Industrial Revolution, but it pursued a slightly different path from its European rivals, favoring a slow and steady approach that prioritized numerous small artisanal industries over the large factories that were beginning to dominate the world. Some of this was by design, and some was because they had lost their most skilled workers years before realizing how crucial they would become for better or worse. This slower development during a period of rapid global wealth creation meant that France built an economy that valued its workers as much as other countries valued the factories that employed them. This is a historical trend that has clearly persisted into the modern era, where French workers, more so than any others worldwide, are renowned for forcefully demanding their rights in the most dramatic ways imaginable. However, this unique past has bequeathed the country an equally uncertain future. Today, France is caught between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, it cannot afford to operate its economy, as it currently does due to a variety of unfortunate national and global issues. But on the other hand, it cannot implement the necessary somewhat radical changes. It needs to, or else its highly active citizens might simply depart in a bitter repetition of history. The compromise the country is making is almost the worst of both worlds. France, once celebrated for balancing a relatively egalitarian lifestyle with advanced industry, is now home to one of the world's richest men, who amassed his fortune through basic leather goods and accessories, while one man and one industry not of course constitute the entire narrative of a national economy. They are indicative of change. By relinquishing its distinctive economic principles, the country could find itself becoming merely a less competitive imitation of every other advanced Western economy. But to comprehend these challenges and difficult choices, one must as always address a few simple questions. Why does France need to so fundamentally restructure its economy? Why can it not effectively do so? And finally, what will become of the country if it continues to stagnate? The Industrial Revolution was arguably the most significant event in human history over just a few centuries. A mere blink of an eye, by historical standards, the development of machinery and technology that dramatically increased the output of a single worker transformed societies worldwide from primarily agrarian peasants into affluent, comfortable consumers. The creation of machines and technology capable of producing even more machines and technology which in turn generated even more goods for everyone to enjoy is precisely what economists term capital development. Prior to these machines, economies operated almost exclusively on land and labor. The only way to expand an empire was to acquire more land for farming and more people to work on those farms. However, the advent of capital, third factor of production, meant that even sprawling global empires would face challenges from whoever possessed the most advanced technology. Those who could develop this capital, the capitalists, would go on to become wealthier than landowning lords and kings could ever have imagined, simultaneously initiating exponential growth in the human population. Global wealth, and it must be acknowledged, the utilization of finite resources, that is the story as it unfolded for most countries. But it was somewhat different in France. The Industrial Revolution was not like flipping a switch, where one moment everyone was peasant farmers, and the next they were all working on production lines. It was a slow, gradual transition to basic automation in France. Despite being one of the first countries to embrace industrialization, that transition was considerably slower than its other European counterparts. Historians propose a few theories as to why, but broadly it centered on stability and confidence. In the decades preceding the Industrial Revolution, France was consumed by its own revolution, and afterward it was at the epicenter of numerous regional wars. This meant that most of its local industries, transportation networks, and even political systems were designed for conflict rather than innovation. France also suffered from an exodus of skilled workers. Leading up to the Industrial Revolution, these individuals were primarily Protestants fleeing religious persecution, but a significant portion of them were early mechanics and engineer skills that would become highly valuable to a nation seeking to build steam engines and mechanized factories, while these individuals were not then fleeing the country for better economic opportunities. This may be one of the earliest instances of brain drain in history, a phenomenon that continues to afflict the nation of France today. The history is compelling, but the economic outcome was that while other European nations were beginning to form the contours of modern economies, with large corporations dictating vast industrial empires, France's economy remained largely dominated by numerous small artisanal industries. The consequence of this was that while human labor in other industrial economies was often subjected to the literal grinding conditions of early industry, France's workers retained significantly more power over their employers because they were employed by much smaller companies driving industry. If only one company dominates an industry, that's called a monopoly, and typically in economics, this is not considered an ideal situation, because that company can raise its prices and lower standards without much recourse, as there no other options. The alternatives to a monopoly include a duopoly, where two companies dominate an industry, an oligopoly, where only a handful of companies dominate, all the way down to perfect competition, where almost limitless companies are all vying with one another. Now, typically, when evaluating the problems with oligopolies or monopolies, most people, even most economists, will focus on the issues that limited competition can cause for consumers. If only one company manufactures computers, then whatever price they charge for that computer is what the consumer must pay if they wish to purchase it, and that company would have no incentive to invest in research and development to produce a superior computer. Because customers have no other choice, this is indeed a problem. But an even greater problem is its effect on workers. If people must pay a little more for a subpar computer, that is not as detrimental as someone trained in building computers having only one potential employer. If one company controls an entire industry, they can suppress the wages of their workers, because there is nowhere else for those workers to go. Again, the exact opposite of this is perfect competition, with numerous small firms competing with each other for both customers and workers, which describes the situation France found itself in during the Industrial Revolution. The French economy developed more slowly than other European powers, with highly concentrated industrial centers, but it laid the foundation for a more egalitarian culture that has served the country quite well to this day. The trade-off has been that French industry has always been slightly less productive than countries like Germany, the UK, and especially the USA, meaning that even though France is a highly industrialized advanced economy, wages have always been slightly lower. This was particularly true in the post-war period, where French workers, and most European workers, for that matter, actually worked longer hours than workers in the USA, while still producing less overall. Today, that is clearly no longer the case, and France has again opted to sacrifice absolute economic output for a more balanced lifestyle. However, with a greater emphasis on favorable working conditions, robust worker protections, and secure retirements. It was a trade-off that most French workers were quite content with. In fact, for most of the country's modern history, following post-World War II reconstruction, any attempt to challenge those working conditions and protections was met with, let's just say, the kind of resistance that would have served them well in 1940. All of this led to the formation of another critically important element of the French economy as it exists today. The strong hand of the government. France has maintained a capitalist economy for the better part of 2 centuries now, but during that time, it has curtailed the influence of the free market in certain sectors through significant governmental involvement in specific industries. While numerous small companies may have benefited workers, there are also advantages to having some large organizations within an economy, simply because they can operate at scales and in industries that small companies cannot. After the Second World War, France recognized this weakness, and the government actively intervened to rectify the situation by essentially stating, if large operations don't exist, we'll create them ourselves. This economic policy became known as dirigisme. Apologies to any French speakers for the pronunciation. This roughly translates to direction, implying that the government directs the economy through the establishment of industries it deems important, while still inviting private industry to grow alongside or even outcompete government operations. If feasible, the government established state-owned enterprises, such as national banks, national high-speed rail services, Air France, and even Minitel, which was essentially the Internet before the Internet. In simple terms, this was fundamentally a compromise between the two major competing ideologies of the time: communism, where the state owned all industry, and pure market capitalism, where the state's sole role in the economy was to regulate competitive private industry. By creating state enterprises within a free market, France attempted to achieve the best of both worlds. The existence of these companies was funded by the government, not only because they could be genuinely sound investments, but also because it was considered crucial for the country to have these services provided by an organization capable of delivering them at an appropriate scale. From a purely macroeconomic viewpoint, there is nothing inherently unique about a government. In a way, it can be considered just another monopoly that provides certain goods and services, with a minor distinction. When a private company decides what to produce and how to produce it, it evaluates what it can sell, and if it can produce that item in a manner where the selling price exceeds the cost of production. If so, it proceeds. Governments also exist to provide goods and services to participants in an economy, but their motivation differs. They don't need to worry about the specific demand for a good or service, because they don't generate revenue by selling it. they make their money simply by taxing people. This is a very effective method for providing goods and services that are not easily transacted things, like national defense emergency services, and even a functioning legal system all require resources to provide, but it would be difficult to get individuals to pay for them voluntarily, because they are only effective collectively, while some fringe economists argue that all these services could be provided by the private sector. Realistically, a government structure that does not need to concern itself with direct profits from these goods is a much more effective way to provide something like a police force. The sales and marketing department of a government is its taxation office, often coupled with handcuffs for anyone unwilling to pay their societal subscription, and it is highly effective at providing certain goods. On the other hand, certain goods and services are more efficiently provided by the private sector through a free and competitive marketplace. Things like national airlines, national banks, and national manufacturers can face issues of inefficiency because they dominate their markets, and even if private industries are technically permitted to compete with them, it can be difficult to enter a market where a competitor has the financial backing of an entire country. These state enterprises also tend to behave slightly differently in how they produce their goods and services. While a regular private company aims to minimize costs as much as possible to maximize profits, state enterprises are often given additional objectives that may not be the most efficient use of their resources, but instead serve a public good. The obvious example of this is that while a private company will try to minimize its workforce to reduce expenses, a state enterprise will often seek reasons to hire more people. Because high employment is politically popular, they can also be tasked with producing goods and services that would not be economically profitable, such as a national airline flying a low-demand route that connects the country, but would not otherwise cover its costs. It must be acknowledged that most countries do this in one form or another. Even the USA, which does not have a national airline, has program that compensates private airlines to operate low-demand routes. In France, this system was taken to an extreme, and the dirigism that heavily emphasized state enterprise led to an economy that once again fell behind in efficiency and output. In isolation, this might not have been a problem. This might surprise some macroeconomists, but not everything needs to be done in the absolute most efficient way, and sometimes unprofitable public services are worth subsidizing because they elevate living standards of the populace. However, France's economy does not exist in isolation, and now that the global economy is more interconnected than ever, this poses significant challenges for the country. An obvious side effect of a large number of state-owned enterprises operating in an economy is that it drives up inflation. When it is very easy for workers to secure jobs at large state-owned companies that aim to employ as many people as possible, this naturally reduces unemployment. Normally, that's a positive outcome, but if it goes too far, it can create problems. Economists discuss the natural rate of unemployment as the ideal outcome for an economy, but natural unemployment is not zero. Unemployment in most advanced economies, it is actually around 2 to 3%, and an unemployment rate lower than that causes inflation. This is sometimes referred to as the NAIRU, or the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, which can be plotted on a graph like this, where the lower unemployment gets, the higher inflation rises up to an inflection point where the economy begins to experience hyperinflation for only marginal gains in employment. As always, just because something looks good on a theoretical graph doesn't mean it always works in reality. And for the sake of France's economy, it's crucial to explain precisely why this happens. If more people are employed, there will be greater income flowing to households, meaning more individuals have more money to generate increased total demand for everything within that economy. It also means that if companies wish to hire new employees, they will find it more challenging, because there are simply fewer people actively seeking work, compelling them to offer higher wages to entice individuals who already have jobs to switch employers. If all companies engage in this behavior, they will be forced to raise their prices to maintain their profit margins, which in turn will lead people to demand higher wages to keep pace with inflation, driving companies to increase their prices once again in a vicious cycle known as a wage price spiral. This would not necessarily occur if increases in worker pay were matched by increases in worker productivity. If there were 10 people in an economy and 9 of them were employed and paid $1 each to produce 9 baskets of goods, then each basket of goods should sell for $1. If the 10th person also secures a job paying $1 and produces a 10th basket of goods, then that basket's price will remain at $1. However, very quickly these 10 workers will realize they are the sole producers of these goods in the economy and demand higher wages of $150. Since they will still only be producing 10 baskets, all that will do is increase the price of those baskets. So in reality, they are no better off overall. And that assumes the 10th worker is as productive as the first 9, a high level of employment. Also, generally implies that workers are on the whole less productive because replacing them is difficult, and there isn't much pressure to upskill or exert extra effort to secure limited jobs, of course. This was an incredibly oversimplified example. But among our 10 basket makers, there might have been a reason why the 10th worker was unemployed in the first place. This issue is typically compounded in the case of state-owned enterprises, where efficiency and productivity are not always the top priority, thus an exceptionally high level of employment, exceeding the natural rate, will drive up wages faster than total output, leading to more money chasing fewer goods, which is inflation, exactly what happened to France when dirigism was in full swing in the 1980s. The government largely curtailed this policy, but even today France confronts a reality where its workers vehemently insist on maintaining a standard of living that their productive capacity cannot support. Factors such as very generous retirement conditions, limited working hours, and generally robust worker protections have combined with companies that have lost their global competitive edge after decades of strong government safeguarding its population. Is also aging, meaning young workers are compelled to be more productive to sustain a growing number of elderly French workers who anticipate substantial retirement support. On one hand, the government could attempt to make this work by doubling down on high levels of taxation and direct economic control, but beyond potentially running into conflicts with the EU, which mandates free trade among member countries, it could simply force out more of the young workers. It has left young skilled French workers can already earn more in places like Germany, the UK, and especially the USA and France, already experiences one of the highest rates of brain drain among advanced economies. Globally, if they raise taxes to maintain the system of strong protections and benefits, more people will leave. Likewise, if they dismantle those systems and introduce a more competitive dynamic to their economy, beyond merely displeasing economic participants, who were promised they could retire at 55 with a healthy pension, it will give workers even less reason to remain because their wages would fall, and their working conditions would deteriorate. What is actually unfolding is a peculiar blend of both strategies, where France is striving to enhance its overall productivity, while desperately dismantling unsustainable and uncompetitive systems. France still retains some advantages. Its international reputation for artisanal craftsmanship has endured from the days when it adopted a slow and steady approach to industrialization, and today some of its largest industries are simply selling goods that capitalize on that perception. A luxury handbag might cost $100 to produce, but if it's made in France, it could easily sell for 100 times that amount, and in terms of evaluating industry, it doesn't get much better. Yet even so, France is a country that has been living beyond its means for too long. It has afforded its workforce extensive protections and a high quality of life, qualities that frankly many economies could learn from, but now it is simply being outcompeted by places willing to work harder in ways that are more economically competitive. No one can predict the future, least of all economists. But in response, the country is conceding and gradually reshaping its economy to function more like other advanced global superpowers in the long term. This will hopefully benefit them, but inevitably the cost of living beyond one's means must eventually be paid, even for a national economy. So unfortunately, there are likely more challenging but necessary changes ahead for France in the foreseeable future. As we've noted, the resistance to these issues is one of the factors that makes France such an intriguing economy. Even if the changes are necessary, French workers do an excellent job of ensuring their discontent is heard. Germany, Italy, and France collectively account for more than half of the entire EU economy. Their struggles are not merely national. They are systemic. Aging workforces, declining productivity, and political gridlock characterize their situations. And while each country has a unique narrative, the common thread is clear. Europe is entering an era where growth cannot be assumed. These are advanced economies that helped define modern prosperity, and now they are illustrating what happens when old systems confront new realities. The critical question is who adapts and who stagnates. What do you think is the biggest obstacle facing these European economies? Share your thoughts in the comments below.